Every story has a moment that changes everything. And today, we're about to discover it. Birmingham Shuttlesworth International Airport was overflowing with movement. Rolling suitcases rattled across polished floors. Boarding announcements echoed from every direction. Travelers hurried past coffee stands. Security lines stretched toward the entrance, and children clutched backpacks while parents checked departure boards with growing impatience. Gate B12 was especially crowded that afternoon. A flight bound for Chicago was boarding soon, and passengers were gathering near the counter, holding boarding passes and watching the clock. Among them stood Alice Carter. Her navy scrubs were hidden beneath a long coat, and a small travel bag rested on her shoulder. She kept glancing at her phone, quietly counting the minutes. This trip meant everything. Years of late-night study sessions, double shifts at the hospital, and sacrifices had finally led to this moment. One flight. One opportunity. Chicago was waiting. But just a few feet away, something suddenly went terribly wrong. A tall man near the gate staggered. At first, it looked like simple exhaustion. He reached for a nearby seat but missed it completely. His knees buckled, and his body crashed onto the airport floor with a heavy thud. Gasps rippled through the crowd. People froze. A few stepped back, others stared, unsure what to do. Someone shouted for help, but no one moved close enough to touch him. The man's chest struggled to rise. His breathing sounded wrong. Panic spread through the gate area as travelers looked at one another, hoping someone else would take responsibility. Alice saw everything. For half a second, she stood still. Her boarding group had just been called. Her flight was about to begin boarding. The moment she had worked toward for years was only minutes away. Yet right in front of her, a stranger was fighting for his life. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. The crowd kept backing away. No one stepped forward. Until Alice made a decision. She dropped her bag on the floor and ran toward the man. A man was dying in the middle of an airport, and the only person who could save him was about to miss the most important flight of her life. Alice dropped to her knees beside the man. Up close, the situation looked far worse. His face had turned pale, almost gray. One hand clutched his chest while the other lay motionless on the floor. His eyes were half open but unfocused, as if he were slipping away from the noise and movement surrounding him. "Sir, can you hear me?" Alice asked firmly. No response. A few passengers gathered in a wide circle, watching anxiously. Phones appeared in several hands. Someone whispered that an ambulance should be called. Another person asked if anyone knew CPR. Alice already knew the answer. She placed 2 fingers against the man's neck. Nothing, no pulse. Her training took over immediately. "Someone call 911, she shouted without looking up. A woman nearby quickly pulled out her phone and began dialing. Alice adjusted the man onto his back, positioning her hands at the center of his chest. Her movements were precise, controlled, the result of years working in emergency care. 1 compression, 2, 3. The crowd grew quieter with every push. Over the airport speakers, another announcement echoed through the terminal. "Now boarding Group 1 for Flight 728 to Chicago." Alice heard it. Her heart tightened. That was her flight. A man standing behind the crowd glanced toward the boarding gate and then back at Alice. "Miss, I think that's your plane boarding." She didn't respond. Her focus stayed on the man beneath her hands. 30 compressions. She tilted his head back and checked his airway. Still nothing. The seconds felt heavier now. "Is there a defibrillator nearby?" Alice called out. A security guard rushed toward the wall cabinet and grabbed the airport's emergency AED unit. Passengers began whispering among themselves. "She's a nurse. Is he going to make it? Is the ambulance coming?" It was time. Time she didn't have. Her phone vibrated in her coat pocket. The airline notification appeared on the screen. Final boarding will begin shortly. The Chicago leadership program she had fought so hard to enter would begin the next morning. Missing this flight meant missing orientation, missing the opening evaluation, and possibly losing the opportunity entirely. Years of work, years of discipline, all tied to a plane that was preparing to leave the gate. Alice's hands paused for a fraction of a second, just long enough for reality to hit her. If she stayed, she would almost certainly miss the flight. If she left now, someone else might take over. But no one in the crowd had stepped forward yet. She looked around. Dozens of people watched. No one moved closer. No one knelt beside her. In that moment, a quiet question formed. Not just for Alice, but for everyone standing there. Would you stay or would you walk away? Alice looked down at the man again. His chest was still. His life was hanging by seconds. Another boarding announcement echoed across the terminal. Flight 728 to Chicago now boarding Group 2. Alice inhaled slowly. The decision was no longer theoretical. It was happening right now. She pressed her hands firmly back onto the man's chest and continued the compressions. Chicago would have to wait. The AED unit arrived in Alice's hands within seconds. The security guard knelt beside her, slightly out of breath. Here, Alice opened the case quickly, her fingers moving with calm urgency. Inside were the adhesive pads and the small screen that would analyze the man's heart rhythm. Everyone step back, she instructed. The crowd shuffled backward, forming a wider circle around them. Alice placed the first pad on the man's chest and the second along his side. The machine powered on automatically, its mechanical voice cutting through the noise of the terminal. Analyzing heart rhythm. Do not touch the patient. Alice lifted her hands and waited. Every second felt longer than the last. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the gate. Passengers were lining up now, scanning their boarding passes as they walked down the jet bridge. The airline attendant stood near the entrance, guiding travelers through one by one. Her flight, her future, slowly moving away from her. The machine beeped again. Shock advised. Charging. A nervous murmur spread through the onlookers. Alice swallowed. She had seen moments like this in the hospital, but something about this situation felt heavier. Maybe it was the open space of the airport. Maybe it was the dozens of strangers watching. Or maybe it was the silent truth she had already accepted. She was not getting on that plane. The machine finished charging. Stand clear. Alice raised her voice. Everyone back. She made sure no one was touching the man. Her finger hovered over the flashing button. Across the terminal, another announcement echoed from the speakers. Final boarding will begin shortly for Flight 728 to Chicago. Alice pressed the button. The man's body jolted slightly from the electrical shock. The AED beeped again. Resume CPR. Without hesitation, Alice returned to compressions. 1, 2, 3. Her arms began to ache, but she kept going. Sweat formed along her forehead as the minutes stretched on. Behind her, the line at the gate grew shorter. Passengers disappeared into the jet bridge. The airport clock on the wall ticked forward. The window for her flight was closing. The security guard glanced toward the gate and then back at Alice. He seemed to understand the weight of what she was sacrificing. You're doing the right thing, he said quietly. Alice didn't answer. She couldn't. Her focus stayed on the rhythm of her hands and the faint hope that the man's heart would respond. The machine began analyzing again. Another pause. Another long breath held by everyone around them. Then, a weak cough escaped from the man's throat. Alice froze for half a second. His chest lifted slightly. Another breath followed. The crowd gasped. He's breathing, someone shouted. Relief swept through the group like a wave. Alice quickly checked his pulse again. This time she felt it. Faint. But there. The man was alive. Sirens could be heard in the distance now as airport medical responders rushed toward the gate area. Alice leaned back on her heels, exhausted. For a brief moment, everything around her seemed quieter. She looked up toward the gate one more time. The boarding line had disappeared. The jet bridge door was closing. Her flight to Chicago was gone. Years of preparation. Left behind on the other side of that door. But the man lying on the airport floor was still breathing. And that meant something. Something far more important than a seat on a plane. What Alice didn't know yet was that this moment, this single decision, had already begun changing her life in ways she could not possibly imagine. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder. Within moments, airport medical responders rushed through the crowd carrying emergency equipment. They moved quickly but carefully, kneeling beside the man Alice had just revived. Pulse? One of them asked. Faint, but stable, Alice replied, catching her breath. The responder nodded and began checking the man's vitals while another prepared an oxygen mask. The crowd that had gathered earlier was still watching closely. Some whispered to one another, others quietly recorded the scene on their phones. A few minutes earlier, the airport had been filled with routine travel noise. Now Gate B12 had become the center of attention. Alice slowly stood up, her legs slightly shaky from the effort. Her coat sleeves were wrinkled, and a few strands of hair had fallen loose around her face. She stepped back to give the responder space. One of the paramedics looked up at her. You the one who started CPR? Alice nodded. You probably saved his life. She gave a small, tired smile but didn't say anything. For her, the moment wasn't about recognition. It was about relief. The man was alive. That was enough. But while the responders worked, something unexpected began happening among the crowd. A middle-aged man near the front of the group leaned forward, studying the patient's face more carefully. His eyes widened. "Wait, is that?" Another traveler stepped closer. "Hold on, I think it is." Whispers started spreading through the group. "Isn't that him?" "No way. Look again." One woman pulled out her phone and searched quickly. Within seconds, she turned the screen toward the others standing nearby. The photo on her screen matched the man lying on the floor. The man Alice had just saved wasn't just another traveler passing through the airport. He was someone the city of Birmingham knew very well. One of the paramedics looked up after hearing the murmurs. "Clear some space, please." But the whispers kept growing. "The David Whitmore?" "Yes, the Whitmore." Alice heard the name but didn't react immediately. She was still focused on the responders stabilizing the patient. Then the paramedic closest to the man spoke quietly to his partner. "If this is really him, the hospital will want to know right away." Alice frowned slightly. The name sounded familiar, very familiar. David Whitmore was not just a wealthy traveler. He was one of the most powerful businessmen in Birmingham. The founder of Whitmore Holdings, a man whose companies employed thousands of people across Alabama, a man who funded hospitals, universities, and major community projects. Alice blinked slowly as the realization settled in. The stranger she had chosen to help was someone whose name appeared on buildings across the city, someone who had the power to shape careers, businesses, and entire communities. Airport security had started arriving now, gently directing people to step back while medical responders prepared to move the patient onto a stretcher. But the whispers continued. People kept looking between Alice and the man on the ground, as if they understood something she didn't yet. Alice had just missed the most important flight of her life. Yet the man she saved was not an ordinary traveler. And unknown to her, the consequences of that choice were only beginning, because when David Whitmore woke up, he would want to know exactly one thing: who saved his life. The stretcher wheels rolled quickly across the airport floor as paramedics guided David Whitmore toward the waiting ambulance outside. Airport security cleared a path through the crowd while travelers stepped aside, still whispering about what they had just witnessed. Alice remained near gate B12, quietly catching her breath. The noise of the airport slowly returned to normal. Boarding calls resumed. Suitcases rolled past again. Travelers hurried toward their own destinations. For everyone else, life at the airport was continuing as if nothing had happened. But for Alice Carter, everything had changed. She looked toward the Chicago gate one last time. The door to the jet bridge was now closed. Through the large window, she could see the aircraft sitting on the runway, preparing to move. Her flight, the opportunity she had worked toward for years, gone. Alice picked up her travel bag from the floor, brushing a bit of dust from the side. Her phone buzzed again with a notification from the airline. Flight 728, departed. She stared at the screen for a moment. No anger, no regret, just a quiet acceptance, because somewhere outside that airport, inside an ambulance racing toward the hospital, a man was still alive. And a few minutes earlier, that had not been certain. Alice turned and slowly began walking away from the gate, unaware that dozens of people were still watching her. Some had already started sharing videos online. Others were talking about the nurse who had stayed behind when everyone else hesitated. But Alice didn't notice any of it. She believed the moment was over. A stranger had needed help. She helped. And that was the end of it, or so she thought, because the man she saved was not just any traveler passing through Birmingham. David Whitmore was a man whose influence stretched across businesses, charities, hospitals, and leadership programs across the country, including one very familiar program in Chicago. And when he regained consciousness, there was one question he would not stop asking. Who saved my life? The answer to that question would set off a chain of events that Alice Carter could never have predicted. A missed flight, a life saved, and a decision made in a crowded airport that would soon open doors she never imagined possible. But before we continue the story, pause for a moment and think about the choice Alice faced. If you were standing in that airport, if helping someone meant losing the opportunity you had spent years chasing, would you stay, or would you board the plane? Let me know your answer in the comments. And if stories like this move you, inspire you, or make you think about the kind of person you want to be, take a moment to support the channel. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who believes that one good decision can change everything. Because here's the truth. Alice Carter believed she had simply helped a stranger, but the truth about the man she saved was about to change her life in ways she never saw coming. Welcome and channel introduction. Welcome to Mr. Obama Stories, where stories don't just get told, they come alive. This is the home of powerful American stories. Stories of struggle, success, mystery, history, and the unforgettable moments that shaped people, communities, and dreams. From inspiring life journeys to shocking real events, every story here is crafted to make you think, feel, and see the world differently. At Mr. Obama Stories, we believe every voice matters and every story carries a lesson. Whether it's motivation, history, real-life drama, or untold experiences, you'll always leave with something unforgettable. So sit back, relax, and let the story begin. Because here, every story has a meaning, and every meaning has a story. Subscribe and become part of the journey. Long before the crowded airport, the flashing emergency lights, and the choice that would alter the direction of her life, Alice Carter belonged to a neighborhood where people believed deeply in one simple idea: no one stands alone. Birmingham, Alabama, had always been a city built on resilience. Its streets carried the weight of history, courage, struggle, and progress. Yet beyond the busy downtown streets and office buildings, there were neighborhoods where community still meant something personal. Alice grew up in one of those neighborhoods. It was the kind of place where front porches stayed full during warm evenings, and where children played outside until the streetlights flickered on. The houses stood close together, painted in different shades of color, each with its own small yard and familiar faces. Neighbors didn't just wave politely as they passed. They stopped to talk. They checked in on each other, and when someone needed help, help arrived without being asked. Alice's childhood unfolded on a quiet street where laughter carried easily through open windows and where the smell of barbecue could travel half a block on Sunday afternoons. Those Sundays were special. Every week, families gathered in backyards or along the sidewalk, bringing folding chairs, coolers, and homemade dishes that had been passed down through generations. Someone would always bring ribs slowly cooked over charcoal. Another neighbor might bring baked macaroni, green seasoned just right, or sweet tea chilled with ice. Music floated through the air, while children ran through the grass, chasing each other between parked cars and garden fences. Alice loved those afternoons. She loved how everyone seemed connected, like pieces of a family that stretched beyond bloodlines. The adults talked about work, school, and church while the older kids helped watch the younger ones. If someone's car broke down, 3 neighbors would appear with tools before the tow truck even arrived. That was the rhythm of the neighborhood: shared responsibility, shared pride, shared care. Alice's family believed deeply in those same values. From a young age, she learned that kindness wasn't something you saved for special occasions. It was something you practiced every day. If a neighbor needed groceries, you helped carry the bags. If someone was sick, you checked on them. If a child fell while playing, every adult nearby made sure they stood back up safely. Alice grew up watching those moments unfold around her. They shaped how she understood the world. Compassion wasn't taught through long lectures or strict rules. It was shown through actions. Small, quiet actions that spoke louder than words. By the time Alice reached elementary school, many people in the neighborhood already knew her name, not because she demanded attention, but because she listened. She was the kind of child who noticed when someone looked tired, or when a neighbor needed help picking up something that had fallen. Teachers often described her as calm and thoughtful. While other children rushed through their assignments, Alice took her time. She focused carefully on what she was doing, making sure things were done right. She also asked questions that surprised people. Not questions meant to challenge authority, but questions meant to understand people. Why someone looked sad. Why a classmate seemed upset. Why certain problems felt harder for some families than others. Those questions showed something deeper about Alice. She didn't just see situations. She noticed people inside those situations. At home, family conversations often circled around helping others. Stories about neighbors who had supported each other during difficult times were shared regularly. Someone would remember how the entire street helped repair a roof after a storm. Another story might recall how neighbors brought meals to a family when illness kept them from working. Those stories became lessons. Lessons about responsibility. Lessons about empathy. Lessons about standing up when someone needed support. Alice absorbed those values quietly. She didn't think of them as something special. To her, they simply felt normal. As she grew older, that sense of care began to show in other ways. During middle school, Alice often volunteered to help classmates who struggled with assignments. She stayed after class to explain lessons, sometimes repeating explanations several times until someone finally understood. She never seemed impatient. She never complained. Helping people made sense to her. Her teachers noticed. One afternoon, a teacher pulled her aside after class. "You have a gift," the teacher told her gently. Alice looked confused. "A gift?" she asked. "Yes," the teacher said. "You see people differently. You notice when someone needs help before anyone else does." Alice didn't fully understand the meaning of those words at the time, but the teacher's observation would stay with her for years. Outside of school, life in the neighborhood continued moving with its familiar rhythm. Summer evenings filled the sidewalks with conversation. Older residents sat in lawn chairs sharing stories about Birmingham's past, while younger families planned school activities and church events. The community believed deeply in progress. Parents pushed their children to aim higher, study harder, and pursue opportunities that earlier generations had been denied. Education mattered, service mattered, character mattered. Alice carried those expectations with quiet determination. She didn't chase attention or recognition. Instead, she focused on doing what felt right, helping when help was needed, listening when someone needed to talk, standing nearby when someone felt alone. Those qualities slowly shaped the person she would become. They also planted the seeds of a future she had not yet imagined, because compassion, when practiced long enough, begins to guide the direction of a life. Alice Carter was still young, still discovering her place in the world, but the foundation had already been built, a foundation formed by a neighborhood that believed in unity, a family that believed in kindness, and a young girl who believed that caring for others was simply the way life should be lived. Years later, that belief would follow her into a crowded airport terminal. But at this point in her story, Alice was still just a girl growing up in Birmingham, learning lessons that would quietly prepare her for the moment when someone's life would depend on her courage. By the time Alice Carter turned 16, the lessons she had learned growing up in Birmingham had already shaped the way she looked at people. She believed in helping when someone needed it. She believed in patience. She believed that kindness mattered even in moments when no one seemed to be paying attention. But she still hadn't discovered the path her life would take. That moment arrived during a quiet evening that started like any other. Alice had just returned home from school. Her backpack rested against the kitchen chair while she worked through a stack of homework at the dining table. The house carried the comforting smell of dinner cooking in the kitchen, and the television murmured softly in the background. Everything felt ordinary, until a sudden noise shattered the calm. A glass slipped from someone's hand and crashed against the floor. Alice looked up instantly. Across the room, her grandmother was gripping the edge of the counter, her face tight with discomfort. "Alice," she whispered weakly. Something was wrong. Alice pushed her chair back and rushed across the room. Her grandmother's breathing sounded uneven, and one hand pressed tightly against her chest. Fear moved quickly through Alice's body. She had never seen her grandmother like this. "Grandma, sit down," Alice said quickly, guiding her toward a chair, but her grandmother's legs trembled as she tried to move. Within moments, the room filled with urgency. A phone call was made. Voices rose with worry. Minutes stretched longer than they should have. The ambulance arrived with flashing lights reflecting off the house windows. Paramedics moved quickly, asking questions while preparing equipment. Alice stood nearby, trying to stay calm, but her heart pounded loudly in her chest. She followed as they helped her grandmother onto a stretcher. Inside the emergency department, nurses and doctors moved with practiced coordination. Machines beeped softly while medical staff spoke in steady, reassuring voices. Alice sat in the waiting area, gripping her hands tightly together. The world inside the hospital felt different from anything she had experienced before. Conversations were focused and calm. Everyone seemed to understand their role. After some time, a nurse approached Alice. Her voice was warm. "You must be the granddaughter," the nurse said gently. Alice nodded. The nurse explained that doctors were running tests and that they were doing everything possible to make sure her grandmother was stable. Alice listened carefully, hanging on to every word. What stood out most wasn't just the information the nurse shared, it was the way she shared it. Her tone carried patience. Her expression showed genuine concern. She spoke slowly enough for Alice to understand, never making the situation feel more frightening than it already was. Hours passed before Alice was finally allowed to visit her grandmother's room. When she stepped inside, her grandmother looked tired but stable. Medical equipment stood nearby, quietly monitoring her condition. The same nurse who had spoken with Alice earlier was standing beside the bed, adjusting an IV line. Alice watched closely. The nurse checked the monitors, spoke gently to her grandmother, and made sure she was comfortable before stepping away. Nothing about her movements felt hurried. Everything she did carried quiet confidence. Alice stood there silently, observing. For the first time, she began to notice how much responsibility rested in the hands of someone like that nurse. She wasn't just following instructions. She was caring for a person. She was calming fears. She was guiding families through moments filled with uncertainty. At one point, the nurse turned toward Alice. "You can come closer," she said kindly. Alice stepped beside the bed. Her grandmother opened her eyes slightly and offered a faint smile. "I'm all right," she whispered. Relief washed through Alice. The nurse checked a few readings on the monitor before turning back to Alice. "You handled everything very well today," she said. Alice blinked, slightly surprised. "I was just trying to help," she replied quietly. The nurse smiled. "That matters more than you know." Those words stayed with Alice long after that night. She watched the nurse continue working through the hallway, moving from one patient room to another. Each interaction carried the same patience, the same respect, the same steady calm. In that moment, something shifted inside Alice. She realized that the compassion she had grown up practicing in her neighborhood had a place in the world beyond her street. There were people whose entire profession was built around helping others during their most difficult moments. People who brought reassurance into rooms filled with fear. People who used skill, knowledge, and empathy to protect lives. Alice understood something clearly for the first time. That was the kind of person she wanted to become. Not someone who simply watched from the sidelines, but someone who stepped forward when people needed help the most. When her grandmother was eventually discharged from the hospital days later, the doctors explained that she would recover with proper care. The relief in Alice's family was overwhelming. But Alice carried something else with her when she left the hospital. A sense of direction, the quiet understanding that her life's purpose might be waiting in places like the hospital she had just walked through. From that day forward, Alice began paying closer attention to the medical world. She read about nursing programs. She asked questions during school career days. She spoke with teachers about science classes that would prepare her for healthcare. The decision did not arrive through a dramatic announcement. It grew slowly and steadily, like a seed planted during one long night inside a hospital hallway. And over the years that followed, that seed would grow into a determination strong enough to carry Alice Carter through challenges she had not yet imagined. Now, she had discovered a way to turn that instinct into a lifelong calling. The decision Alice Carter made at 16 did not fade with time. Instead, it grew stronger with every passing year. High school became the first proving ground for the future she had quietly chosen. While many of her classmates still debated what they wanted to do after graduation, Alice already understood the direction she wanted to pursue. Healthcare, helping people when they were vulnerable, standing beside families during moments that felt uncertain or frightening. That goal shaped the way she approached school. Science classes received her full attention. Biology textbooks filled with handwritten notes began piling up on her desk at home. She spent long evenings reviewing material that many students found difficult, but to Alice it felt meaningful. Each concept she learned brought her one step closer to the life she imagined. Her teachers noticed the discipline. They noticed how she stayed after class to ask questions. They noticed how she treated every assignment with seriousness, even when no one else seemed to care. When graduation approached, Alice applied to nursing programs with cautious hope. She understood the competition would be strong. Many students across the country shared the same dream. But the work she had invested paid off. She was accepted into a respected nursing program that would prepare her for the career she had envisioned since that night in the hospital with her grandmother. The years that followed demanded everything she had. Nursing school was not gentle. The coursework moved quickly. Clinical training placed students inside hospitals where real patients depended on accurate decisions. There were long nights filled with textbooks, early mornings preparing for exams, and moments when exhaustion made every step feel heavier. Alice experienced all of it. Yet she never lost sight of the purpose behind the struggle. During clinical rotations, she stood beside experienced nurses who showed her what the profession truly required. Compassion remained important, but skill mattered just as much. A nurse had to recognize small changes in a patient's condition. A nurse had to respond quickly when emergencies appeared. A nurse had to communicate clearly with doctors, families, and fellow staff members. Alice learned those lessons one shift at a time. When she finally graduated and entered the workforce as a registered nurse, the reality of hospital life became even clearer. 12-hour shifts often stretched longer. Some days moved smoothly. Other days delivered situations that demanded every ounce of focus she possessed. Patients arrived with conditions that ranged from minor injuries to life-threatening emergencies. Families waited anxiously for updates. Medical teams worked together to stabilize situations that could change within seconds. Alice handled each shift with the calm determination that had always guided her. Her coworkers began to notice. She never complained about long hours. She rarely asked for recognition. Instead, she focused on doing the work well. If another nurse needed help finishing tasks before the end of a shift, Alice stepped in without hesitation. If a patient needed extra reassurance during a difficult moment, Alice found the time to sit beside them and listen. Over the years, that steady dedication built a quiet reputation within the hospital. Alice Carter was dependable, she was thoughtful, and she cared deeply about the people she served. Yet while she loved the work itself, Alice also noticed something else during her time in the hospital. Good leadership made an enormous difference. The best hospital units functioned smoothly because strong leaders guided the staff, organized resources, and ensured that every patient received proper attention. Those leaders understood both medicine and people. They balanced decisions that affected entire teams while still remembering the individual needs of each patient. Alice began wondering whether she could grow into that kind of role. Not because she wanted authority, but because leadership offered another way to help others on a larger scale. If she could influence how care was delivered across an entire department, the impact could reach hundreds of patients instead of one at a time. That realization pushed her to explore opportunities for professional growth, workshops, additional certifications, leadership seminars offered through the hospital system. Each opportunity added another layer to her understanding of healthcare. It described a competitive medical leadership program being hosted in Chicago. The program gathered promising healthcare professionals from across the country. Participants would spend weeks studying advanced leadership strategies, hospital management techniques, and innovative approaches to patient care. Graduates of the program often moved into influential roles within hospitals and healthcare organizations. For Alice, the description felt almost unreal. This was the kind of opportunity that could reshape an entire career, but admission would not be easy. Only a limited number of applicants were accepted each year. Candidates were evaluated based on experience, recommendations, and demonstrated commitment to improving healthcare systems. Alice hesitated before submitting her application. The competition would be intense. Many applicants likely held impressive titles and years of experience beyond her own. Still, she reminded herself of something she had learned growing up in Birmingham. You never know what doors might open unless you knock. So she completed the application. Weeks passed. Work at the hospital continued as usual. Long shifts filled her schedule while she tried not to think too much about the program. Then one morning, a message arrived. Alice opened the email slowly, almost afraid to read the result. Her eyes scanned the first sentence. Congratulations. For a moment she simply stared at the screen. She had been accepted. The leadership program in Chicago would begin in a matter of weeks. Excitement quickly mixed with nervous energy. This opportunity represented more than professional advancement. It represented years of effort finally opening a new path forward. Alice began preparing for the trip immediately. Travel arrangements were confirmed. Schedules were organized at the hospital. Friends and coworkers congratulated her as the departure date approached. For the first time in a long while, Alice allowed herself to imagine the possibilities waiting ahead. New knowledge, new connections, a chance to return to Birmingham with skills that could improve patient care for countless people. All of it depended on one simple step: boarding a plane to Chicago. And on the morning of her departure, Alice Carter believed that flight would carry her directly toward the future she had worked so hard to reach. She had no way of knowing that her journey would take an unexpected turn before the plane ever left the runway. The morning Alice Carter left for the airport began earlier than usual. Long before sunrise painted the Birmingham sky with soft color, her alarm clock buzzed beside the bed. For a moment, Alice remained still, letting the quiet of the room settle around her. The early morning carried a calm energy, the kind that often comes before an important day. Today was one of those days. She sat up slowly and looked toward the small travel bag resting near the door. Everything had been packed the night before: carefully folded clothes, important documents, and the program materials she had printed for the leadership course waiting in Chicago. The realization returned quickly. The journey she had worked toward for years was finally beginning. Alice moved through her morning routine with steady focus. Coffee brewed quietly in the kitchen while she checked her phone for the time. A notification blinked on the screen, A message had arrived overnight. She opened it and smiled. It was a short note from a close friend who had known about the program for weeks. "You're going to do amazing things out there. Birmingham is proud of you." Alice read the message twice before typing a quick thank you. Another message arrived moments later. This one came from someone who had worked beside her during countless hospital shifts. "Don't forget about us when you become the boss." Alice laughed softly. She knew the message was meant as encouragement, but it reminded her of something deeper. The opportunity ahead carried responsibility. The leadership program wasn't simply about personal advancement. It was about learning how to improve patient care for entire communities. Alice hoped to bring those lessons back home. After finishing breakfast, she checked the time again. Her flight would depart later that morning, but Birmingham Shuttlesworth Airport was known for busy departure schedules. She preferred arriving early. The drive across the city passed quietly. Traffic moved smoothly as the sun slowly climbed above the horizon, lighting the streets with the promise of a clear day. As Alice approached the airport entrance, she felt a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. The large glass structure of the terminal reflected the growing daylight while travelers moved in and out of the entrance doors. Suitcases rolled across the pavement. Taxi drivers helped unload luggage. Airport staff guided passengers toward check-in counters. Alice parked her car and paused for a moment before stepping out. This was the beginning of something new. A small wave of emotion moved through her as she looked at the terminal building. Every step she had taken during the past decade had led here. She picked up her bag and walked toward the entrance. Inside, the airport was already alive with activity. Large digital boards displayed departure times while announcements echoed through the high ceilings. Travelers moved between ticket counters, security checkpoints, and coffee stands. Families hugged goodbye near the entrance. Business travelers reviewed documents while waiting in line. The energy inside the terminal felt contagious. Everyone was heading somewhere. Everyone carried a story about why their journey mattered. Alice moved through security and entered the departure area, glancing at the screens until she located her gate number. Gate B12. Her flight to Chicago would board from there. With time to spare, she found a seat near the gate and placed her bag beside her chair. Her phone buzzed again. This one came from someone who had watched her career grow from the beginning. "Remember where you started. You're going to represent Birmingham well." Alice leaned back in her chair, taking a slow breath. The encouragement meant a lot. It reminded her that the trip was bigger than one person. The leadership program offered a chance to bring new ideas back to the hospital, where she had spent so many long shifts helping patients. She imagined the classrooms in Chicago, the knowledge she would gain. For the first time that morning, Alice allowed herself to feel pure excitement. Her eyes moved toward the large window beside the gate. Outside, aircraft waited along the runway, while ground crews prepared them for departure. One of those planes would soon carry her toward a future filled with possibility. Alice checked the boarding time again. Everything was moving according to plan. At least, that was what she believed. Because at that moment, sitting calmly near gate B12, Alice Carter had no idea that within minutes the entire course of her day, and her life, was about to change. Gate B12 buzzed with the restless movement common to busy airports. Passengers adjusted bags beneath their seats, checked the time on their phones, and listened carefully for the next announcement from the boarding counter. Some travelers sat quietly reading, while others walked back and forth near the windows overlooking the runway. Alice Carter sat calmly among them, her travel bag resting beside her chair. From where she sat, she could see aircraft being guided along the tarmac outside. Ground crews moved around the planes with careful coordination while luggage carts passed across the runway. Everything looked routine. Inside the terminal, the steady rhythm of travel continued. A family nearby discussed their connecting flight. A man in a business suit typed quickly on his laptop while sipping coffee. A young couple studied a map, pointing towards something they planned to see in Chicago. Alice watched the activity with quiet interest. Moments like this always carried a sense of anticipation. Airports were filled with beginnings, people heading toward new jobs, family reunions, vacations, or important meetings. Each traveler carried a destination and a purpose. Soon, Alice would be one of them. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook where she had written a few thoughts about the leadership program she would soon attend. Ideas about patient care, notes about teamwork inside hospital departments, questions she hoped to explore during the training sessions. She flipped through the pages slowly. If the program delivered everything it promised, she would return to Birmingham with knowledge that could strengthen the hospital where she worked. Her attention shifted when a man walked past the row of seats in front of her. He appeared to be in his late 50s or early 60s, well-dressed, confident in his posture, carrying the kind of presence that suggested he was used to important responsibilities. He paused briefly near the gate counter, glancing at the departure screen. For a moment nothing seemed unusual, then his hand moved toward his chest. At first it looked like a small gesture, as if he were adjusting his jacket or reacting to discomfort. But within seconds, something changed. His steps slowed, his body leaned slightly forward, the expression on his face tightened with sudden strain. A woman standing nearby noticed first. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked cautiously. The man did not answer. His knees weakened. Before anyone could react, his body collapsed heavily onto the terminal floor. The sound of the fall echoed sharply across the gate area. Conversations stopped instantly, heads turned. For a brief moment the entire section of the terminal seemed frozen. Passengers stared in disbelief. The man lay motionless on the floor, one arm stretched awkwardly beside him. A small crowd quickly gathered around him, but no one moved close enough to touch him. Concern spread through the group. Someone should call for help. Is he breathing? Does anyone know what to do? The questions filled the air, yet hesitation held everyone in place. People shifted nervously, unsure how serious the situation might be, or whether stepping forward would make things worse. Alice was already on her feet. Years of hospital training had taught her to recognize the signs of a medical emergency without hesitation. She moved quickly through the gathering crowd, kneeling beside the man. "Please give him space," she said firmly. The people nearest to her stepped back. Alice gently turned the man onto his back and checked his breathing. Something was very wrong. His chest barely moved. His skin looked pale. She reached for his wrist. No pulse. The realization came instantly. Cardiac arrest. Alice looked up at the surrounding passengers. "Call 911, she instructed clearly. A traveler nearby grabbed a phone and began dialing. Alice placed her hands at the center of the man's chest, positioning them exactly as she had done countless times during emergency training. Her focus narrowed completely. 30 compressions. That was the first step. Her arms moved with controlled rhythm as she began pressing firmly against his chest. 1, 2, 3. The crowd watched silently. Airports were places people associated with departures and arrivals, not life-threatening emergencies. Yet right there on the terminal floor, a man's life was hanging by seconds. Alice counted each compression steadily, maintaining the pace she had practiced so many times. Her voice remained calm despite the urgency of the moment. "Has anyone called emergency services?" "Yes," someone replied from the crowd. "They're sending help." When she finished the first set of compressions, she quickly checked the man's breathing again. Still nothing. The surrounding passengers exchanged anxious glances. A few stepped closer, curiosity mixing with concern. One man whispered quietly to someone beside him, "Is she a doctor?" "No," another person replied, "but she looks like she knows what she's doing." Alice continued the compressions. Her arms worked with steady determination while her mind focused on one goal. Restore circulation, keep oxygen moving, buy time until advanced medical help arrived. The sounds of the airport continued faintly in the background, announcements echoing through the terminal, footsteps passing across the floor, distant conversations from other gates. Yet within the circle forming around the scene, everything felt intensely focused. Each compression mattered. Each second mattered. A man's life depended on the actions happening right there on the terminal floor. Alice leaned forward slightly as she continued working. "Stay with me," she murmured quietly, though the man remained unconscious. Someone nearby pointed toward the wall. "There's an AED over there." Airport staff quickly moved to retrieve it. Alice kept working while they ran for the device. Inside the terminal, passengers from nearby gates began noticing the growing crowd. Some walked closer to see what was happening. Within moments, Gate B12 had become the center of attention, but Alice barely noticed the growing audience. Her focus remained entirely on the man whose heart had suddenly stopped beating. The same man who, only minutes earlier, had been walking calmly through the terminal. The same man whose life was now depending on the actions of one nurse who had come to the airport expecting nothing more than a simple flight to Chicago. The automatic external defibrillator arrived within moments. An airport staff member hurried through the crowd carrying the bright emergency case. Several passengers stepped aside quickly, creating space as the device was placed beside Alice. "I've got it," the staff member said, slightly out of breath. Alice nodded and opened the case immediately. Instead of a controlled hospital room, they were surrounded by dozens of travelers watching anxiously from a distance. but the situation remained the same. A life was at risk. Alice quickly removed the pads and placed them carefully on the man's chest, following the diagram printed on the packaging. "Everyone stand back," she instructed. The crowd retreated a few steps. The machine powered on, its calm electronic voice filling the quiet space, analyzing heart rhythm. "Do not touch the patient." Alice lifted her hands and waited. The seconds stretched longer than usual. Nearby, the departure board flickered with updated information for the flight to Chicago. Gate B12. Boarding would begin soon. Alice noticed the time out of the corner of her eye. Her flight. For a brief moment, the reality of where she was returned. She had arrived early. Everything had been perfectly organized. Now she was kneeling on the airport floor performing emergency care for a stranger. The AED beeped. Shock advised. Alice exhaled slowly. That confirmed her concern. The man's heart rhythm was dangerously unstable. The machine continued. "Charging. Stand clear." She raised her voice again. "Everyone step back. Make sure no one is touching him." The passengers moved farther away, forming a wider circle around the scene. Alice glanced quickly toward the gate counter. Airline staff had begun preparing for boarding. Passengers from her flight were gathering nearby, lining up with their carry-on bags and boarding passes. The schedule was moving forward. Right on time. The AED light blinked. "Press the shock button now." Alice pressed it. The man's body jerked slightly from the electrical pulse. The device paused briefly before giving its next instruction. "Begin CPR." Alice returned immediately to chest compressions, her hands pressed firmly against the center of his chest. 1, 2, 3. The crowd watched silently. Some passengers checked their watches. Others looked between Alice and the boarding line forming at the gate. Overhead, the airport speakers crackled to life. "Attention passengers traveling to Chicago on flight 728. Boarding will begin shortly at gate B12. Alice heard the announcement clearly. Her arms continued moving without hesitation. She had trained for moments like this. A person experiencing cardiac arrest could not wait. Every minute without proper circulation reduced the chance of survival. She finished another set of compressions and quickly checked for a pulse again. Still weak, still unstable. The AED began another rhythm analysis. The machine's calm voice repeated its instructions. Passengers in the boarding group slowly formed a line near the counter. Some glanced toward the medical emergency happening only a few steps away. Others focused on the gate agent scanning boarding passes. Alice felt the weight of the moment settle heavily in her mind. She knew exactly what the situation meant. Helping this man properly might take several more minutes, possibly longer. The ambulance had been called, but emergency responders would need time to reach the terminal. Her flight would not wait. A traveler standing near the edge of the crowd spoke quietly. "Miss, I think your flight is boarding." Alice didn't look up. She continued working. Another compression. Another. Her focus remained on the man's condition. The AED spoke again. "Shock advised." Alice quickly prepared for another pulse. "Clear," she called. The shock delivered. The man's chest lifted slightly before falling still again. Alice resumed compressions immediately. Behind her, the boarding line moved steadily forward. Passengers disappeared down the jet bridge one by one. The opportunity Alice had spent years working toward was moving closer to departure with every passing second. But the man beneath her hands remained unconscious. His breathing had not returned. The seconds felt heavier now. Alice paused briefly to check his pulse again. There, a faint rhythm, weak but present. Hope returned, but the situation remained critical. She continued supporting his breathing while keeping his airway open. More airport staff arrived, followed by medical responders carrying additional equipment. They quickly moved beside Alice and began assessing the patient. One responder checked the monitor, another prepared oxygen. "You started CPR?" one of them asked. Alice nodded. "Yes." The responder glanced at the monitor readings. "You probably saved him." Alice sat back slightly, allowing the responders to take over. Her arms felt tired, but her mind remained steady. Across the gate area, the final passengers were boarding the aircraft. Moments later, the gate agent closed the boarding door. Through the terminal window, the plane remained visible on the runway, preparing for departure. Alice watched quietly. The aircraft she was supposed to be on would soon lift into the sky without her. The leadership program in Chicago, the opportunity she had worked toward for years. It was leaving. Yet despite the disappointment that might have been expected, Alice felt something else instead. Relief. The man on the stretcher beside her was breathing again. His pulse, though still weak, had returned. The responders began preparing him for transport to the hospital. As they moved the stretcher toward the exit, the airport slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Passengers resumed their conversations. Announcements continued across the terminal. But one thing had changed. Alice Carter had made a decision that morning. A decision between catching a flight and saving a life. And she had chosen to stay. Behind the terminal windows, the aircraft carrying her original plans slowly began moving down the runway. Within minutes, it lifted into the sky and disappeared into the distance. The hospital corridors in Birmingham looked the same as they always did. Bright lights reflected against polished floors. Medical carts moved quietly between patient rooms. Nurses checked monitors while doctors discussed charts at the central station. For most of the staff, it was an ordinary workday. For Alice Carter, the return felt different. Only a few days had passed since the airport incident, yet the experience still lingered in her mind. She walked through the familiar hallway carrying her clipboard, greeting coworkers as she prepared to begin another shift. The routine of the hospital had always grounded her. After long hours and emotional situations, there was comfort in knowing exactly what needed to be done. Patients needed care, families needed reassurance, charts needed attention. Responsibilities like these kept everything moving forward. Conversations paused when she entered rooms. Several staff members glanced toward her with curiosity. Word had traveled quickly. The story of what happened at Birmingham Shuttlesworth Airport had already made its way through the hospital. Someone had recorded part of the emergency response on a phone. The video had circulated online and eventually reached coworkers who recognized Alice immediately. Inside the staff break room that morning, 2 nurses were already discussing it when she arrived. "That was you, wasn't it?" one of them asked as soon as Alice stepped through the door. Alice paused slightly before nodding. "Yes," she answered calmly. The nurses exchanged amazed looks. "You performed CPR right there in the terminal?" the other asked. Alice poured herself a cup of coffee before responding. "He needed help," she said simply. The conversation grew louder as more staff members entered the room. "I saw the video online. People were saying you saved his life. Were you really about to board a plane?" Alice listened patiently while they spoke. Eventually, someone asked the question that seemed to interest everyone the most. "What about Chicago?" The room grew quieter. The leadership program had been something many people at the hospital knew about. Alice's acceptance had been celebrated during the weeks leading up to her trip. Several coworkers had followed her progress closely. Missing that flight meant something significant. Alice leaned lightly against the counter, holding her coffee cup. "The flight left," she said. The words were calm and straightforward. One of the nurses shook her head in disbelief. "That program could have changed everything for you." Alice did not argue with the statement. She knew the opportunity had been important, but she also knew something else. A man had been lying on the floor without a pulse. At that moment, nothing else mattered. Another coworker spoke carefully. "Do you regret it?" Alice thought about the question for a moment. Her mind briefly returned to the airport terminal, the crowd watching, the AED instructions, the moment when the man's pulse finally returned. She shook her head gently. "No." The answer surprised a few people in the room. One nurse sat down across from her. That must have been a difficult choice. Alice considered the situation again. In truth, the decision had not felt complicated at the time. When someone's life is at risk, hesitation disappears, training takes over, instinct takes over. "I didn't really think about the flight," she explained. "I just focused on helping him." The break room remained quiet for a few seconds. Then one of the older nurses smiled. "That's exactly why you're good at what you do." The shift began shortly afterward. Alice returned to the patient floor where the rhythm of hospital life quickly pulled her back into familiar responsibilities. She checked medication schedules. She updated patient charts. She listened to concerns from families waiting anxiously outside recovery rooms. Hours passed as they always did during busy hospital shifts. Work demanded full attention. Yet during occasional quiet moments, Alice found her thoughts drifting. The future she had imagined before the airport felt uncertain now. The Chicago leadership program had been a rare opportunity. Missing the first session meant she might not receive another invitation. That reality did not bring regret. But it did leave questions about what would come next. Still, Alice had learned something during her years in healthcare. Life rarely followed the plans people created for themselves. Unexpected events often changed the direction of a path. Sometimes those changes led somewhere meaningful. Sometimes they simply required patience. For now, Alice focused on what she had always done best. caring for the patients who depended on her. As the evening shift approached and the hospital lights dimmed slightly, Alice finished reviewing the final charts of the day. Outside the windows, the Birmingham skyline glowed under the setting sun. Life in the city continued moving forward. Somewhere else in that same city, the man she had helped at the airport was waking up after the most dangerous moment of his life. Alice did not know it yet, but the story that began on the floor of an airport terminal was far from over. The room remained quiet after the doctor left. David Whitmore lay back against the pillows, staring toward the large window across the recovery suite. Afternoon light spread softly across the room, reflecting off the polished floor and the medical equipment beside his bed. For the first time since waking, his mind began working through the reality of what had happened. A few days earlier, he had been walking through Birmingham Shuttlesworth International Airport with a full schedule ahead of him. Meetings waited in another city. Important decisions regarding his company were already lined up for the week. Then his heart stopped, just like that. The thought lingered in his mind longer than he expected. But no amount of preparation could prevent the kind of medical emergency he had experienced. Life had paused without warning, and if not for one person stepping forward in the middle of that airport terminal, he would not be lying here now. David shifted slightly in the bed, the monitoring wires adjusting gently with the movement. The name returned to his thoughts again, Alice Carter. He repeated it quietly under his breath. The woman who had interrupted her own journey to help a stranger. The doctor's explanation continued echoing in his mind. She missed her flight. David exhaled slowly. That decision carried weight. He understood the value of opportunity better than most people. Opportunities built companies, they built careers, they changed lives. Yet Alice Carter had walked away from her own opportunity to help someone she had never met. The more he thought about that moment, the more it fascinated him. David Whitmore had built his life in a world where time was measured carefully. Schedules filled weeks in advance. Meetings began precisely when planned. Every decision was evaluated based on results. But the action taken by Alice Carter followed a different principle. It had nothing to do with profit or advancement. It was a choice, based entirely on responsibility. And that choice had given him another chance to live. David's gaze drifted toward the framed photograph resting on a nearby shelf in the room. It had been placed there earlier that morning by a member of the hospital staff who had gathered a few personal items from his belongings. The photograph showed a large warehouse complex surrounded by rows of delivery vehicles. It was one of the earliest facilities built by his company many years ago. David Whitmore had not been born into wealth or influence. His upbringing in Birmingham had been far more modest. His father worked long hours in manual labor jobs that demanded physical endurance but offered little financial security. His mother managed the household, while also working wherever she could find employment. Money was rarely abundant, but one lesson had been repeated constantly during David's childhood. Hard work created opportunity. Those words shaped him from a young age. While other children spent their afternoons playing outside, David often helped his father with small repair jobs or assisted neighbors who needed help moving furniture, fixing fences, or completing yard work. The experience taught him two things. First, nothing meaningful arrived without effort. Second, reliability mattered. People trusted those who showed up and finished what they started. David carried those lessons with him through school and into adulthood. His first real job involved loading delivery trucks for a local supply company. The work was exhausting, but it allowed him to observe something that caught his attention: transportation and logistics. He noticed how goods moved from one location to another, how businesses depended on reliable shipping schedules, and how delays could disrupt entire operations. It was a complicated system, yet it fascinated him. Over time, that curiosity grew into ambition. David began studying how logistics companies operated. He worked his way through different roles within the industry, learning every stage of the process: warehousing, distribution, fleet management. Eventually, he launched his own company with only a few trucks and a small warehouse on the edge of Birmingham. The early years were difficult. Contracts were hard to secure. Competitors already dominated the market. Some weeks the company barely covered operating expenses. But David refused to give up. He worked longer hours than anyone else on his team. He studied industry trends late into the night. He built relationships with businesses that needed dependable transportation. Gradually, the company began to grow. New contracts arrived. More trucks joined the fleet. Additional warehouses expanded the company's reach across multiple states. Within 2 decades, Whitmore Holdings had become one of the most respected logistics companies in the region. Thousands of shipments moved through its network each day. Hundreds of employees depended on the company for their livelihoods. David Whitmore had earned recognition as a leader whose determination transformed a small operation into a major enterprise. Yet despite the success, he never forgot the lessons learned during his early years. Hard work, responsibility, reliability. Those principles guided every major decision he made. Now, lying in a hospital bed after a near-fatal medical emergency, David realized something unexpected. The same values that built his company had also guided the nurse who saved his life. Alice Carter had acted without hesitation. She saw a problem and took responsibility. She finished what needed to be done. David felt a quiet respect forming in his mind. He had spent years evaluating people based on their actions, and Alice Carter's actions spoke clearly. She was someone worth knowing. Outside the window, the city of Birmingham continued its steady rhythm. Traffic moved through the streets. Businesses opened their doors. Life continued forward. But inside the recovery suite, David Whitmore had reached a decision of his own. Once he left the hospital, there was something he intended to do. He was going to find Alice Carter, not simply to say thank you, but to understand the person whose courage had changed both of their lives in a single moment inside an airport terminal. A cool breeze moved through the streets of Birmingham as the late afternoon sun settled between the buildings downtown. The city carried its usual energy, cars passing through intersections, pedestrians walking along sidewalks, and small businesses welcoming customers through open doors. Inside a neighborhood cafe just a few blocks from the hospital, Alice Carter sat near the window with a warm cup of coffee resting between her hands. The cafe had become one of her favorite places during the past few years. It wasn't large or fancy. The wooden tables were simple, the chairs slightly worn from years of use, and the quiet hum of conversation filled the room most afternoons. But the atmosphere always felt comfortable. After long hospital shifts, Alice often stopped there to relax before heading home. Today was no different. Outside the window, Birmingham moved through its familiar rhythm. People hurried past carrying shopping bags. A cyclist rode carefully through traffic. A group of college students laughed as they crossed the street together. Alice took a small sip of her coffee and let the warmth settle. Patients still needed care. Hospital schedules still filled her days. But occasionally the memory of that moment inside the airport terminal returned to her thoughts. Not with regret, just curiosity. She still didn't know what had happened to the man she had helped. After that, the situation disappeared from her life almost as quickly as it had arrived. Alice had assumed that was the end of the story. The small bell above the cafe door rang as someone entered. Alice glanced up briefly. The man standing near the entrance paused for a moment, scanning the room. He looked healthier than he had a few days earlier, though a certain carefulness remained in the way he moved. His posture suggested someone who had recently recovered from illness but was determined to regain his strength. David Whitmore had spent several minutes outside the cafe before finally walking in. Finding Alice Carter had taken more effort than he expected. After leaving the medical facility, he began asking quiet questions about the nurse who had helped him at the airport. Eventually, he learned where she worked and the places she often visited near the hospital. He had not planned exactly what he would say when he finally saw her, but he knew he wanted the chance to thank her properly. Now, standing inside the cafe, he spotted her near the window. For a moment, he simply watched. She looked exactly as he remembered from the brief moment he had seen her during the emergency, focused, calm, and quietly attentive to the world around her. David approached slowly. Alice noticed him when he stopped beside the table. "Excuse me," he said gently. Alice looked up. The moment their eyes met, recognition appeared instantly. Her expression shifted with surprise. "You're the man from the airport," she said. David smiled slightly. "Yes," he replied, "and you're the nurse who saved my life." For a second, neither of them spoke. The memory of that intense moment returned to both of them at the same time. The crowded terminal, the urgency of the situation, and the sudden responsibility that had fallen on Alice's shoulders. David gestured toward the empty chair across from her. "May I sit for a moment?" Alice nodded. "Of course." He lowered himself into the chair carefully, still adjusting to the recovery process. For a few seconds the conversation remained quiet. Finally David spoke. "I've been hoping to find you." Alice tilted her head slightly. "To make sure you were all right?" she asked. "That," he said, "and to say thank you." Alice gave a modest shrug. "You don't have to thank me. Anyone with medical training would have done the same thing." David shook his head gently. "Actually, that's not true." He leaned forward slightly. "There were dozens of people around when it happened. But you were the one who stepped forward. Alice didn't respond immediately. She had never been comfortable receiving praise for doing her job. The responsibility she carried as a nurse had always felt natural to her. David continued speaking. The doctors told me what happened, he said. They said you acted immediately. Alice looked down briefly at her coffee cup. He needed help, she said simply. David studied her expression for a moment. The calm sincerity in her voice impressed him even more than the heroic act itself. You missed your flight because of me, he said quietly. Alice looked back up. That wasn't your fault. But it still happened, David replied. She nodded slightly. Yes, she admitted. It did. The conversation paused again as the cafe's normal sounds filled the background. Customers talked quietly at nearby tables. The barista prepared drinks behind the counter. Sunlight continued filtering through the window beside them. David leaned back in his chair. I'm grateful you were there that day, he said. Alice gave a small smile. Neither of them knew it yet, but that simple conversation inside a small Birmingham cafe was about to become the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Their lives had crossed once during a moment of crisis. Now they were meeting again under far calmer circumstances, and this time the conversation had only just begun. The cafe had grown quieter as the afternoon slowly drifted toward evening. Outside the window beside their table, Birmingham moved through the steady rhythm of the day. Office workers crossed the street carrying briefcases, and traffic lights changed in predictable intervals along the avenue. Inside the cafe, the soft sound of coffee machines and quiet conversation filled the space. Alice Carter and David Whitmore sat across from each other, still absorbing the unexpected nature of their meeting. Only a few days earlier, their lives had intersected under urgent circumstances inside an airport terminal. Now they were sitting calmly at a small table, talking like two ordinary strangers. David studied Alice for a moment before speaking again. I realized something after leaving the hospital, he said. Alice looked up. What was that? I never properly introduced myself. He extended his hand across the table. My name is David Whitmore. Alice shook his hand. Alice Carter. For a moment she studied his expression. She had recognized him from the airport emergency, but she had not known anything about his life outside that moment. What brings you to this cafe? She asked. David smiled lightly. I was hoping to find you. Alice raised an eyebrow slightly. That must have taken some effort. It did, he admitted. After leaving the hospital, David had spent time asking about the nurse who helped him. Eventually, someone connected with the hospital staff mentioned that Alice occasionally visited the cafe near the medical center. He had taken a chance by coming there that afternoon. Alice leaned back in her chair. Well, you found me. David nodded. Yes, I did. For a moment they sat quietly again before Alice asked a question. So what do you do for work? David hesitated slightly. His career had always placed him in environments where people recognized his name immediately. But Alice did not appear to know anything about him beyond the airport incident. I run a logistics company, he said. Alice looked curious. Logistics? Yes, David replied. Transportation, distribution networks, supply chains. My company helps businesses move goods across different regions efficiently. Alice nodded slowly. That sounds complicated. David laughed softly. It can be. He noticed the way Alice listened carefully as he spoke. My company started small, David continued. Just a warehouse and a few trucks, and now it operates across several states. Alice gave a quiet whistle of appreciation. It did. David noticed something interesting about her reaction. Many people responded to his success with excitement about money or status. Alice's reaction was different. She seemed more curious about the effort behind the achievement. What about you? David asked. How long have you been working at the hospital? Alice smiled slightly. Long enough to get used to the long shifts. She took a sip of her coffee before continuing. I became a nurse because of something that happened when I was younger. David leaned forward with interest. What happened? Alice explained briefly about the night her grandmother experienced a medical emergency when she was 16. She described the hospital environment, the nurses working carefully around the room, and the moment she realized that healthcare could become her life's work. David listened closely. The story reminded him of something from his own childhood. Alice nodded. That's true. She then described the neighborhood where she grew up in Birmingham. The cookouts on warm Sundays, neighbors helping each other fix houses or carry groceries. Families looking out for children playing in the street. David recognized the sense of community she described. He had grown up in a similar environment. My parents believe strongly in hard work, he said. Alice smiled. So did mine. For the first time during their conversation, both of them noticed something unexpected. Their lives had followed very different paths. David Whitmore had built a major business organization that managed transportation networks across multiple states. Alice Carter spent her days inside hospital rooms, caring for patients and guiding families through medical uncertainty. Yet the values guiding their choices were remarkably similar. Responsibility, commitment, service to others. David rested his hands on the table. You know something interesting, he said. Alice tilted her head. What? If we had met under normal circumstances, I'm not sure we would have ever crossed paths. Alice considered the idea. That's probably true. Corporate boardrooms, hospital wards, different environments, different schedules, different responsibilities. Yet an unexpected moment inside an airport terminal had connected them. David looked toward the window briefly before turning back to Alice. I'm glad things happened the way they did, he said. Alice raised an eyebrow. You're glad you had a heart attack at the airport? David chuckled. No. I'm glad the person who helped me happened to be you. Alice didn't respond immediately. The sincerity in his voice felt genuine. She glanced down at her coffee cup again. Well, she said quietly, I'm glad you're still here. Their conversation continued as the afternoon light faded slowly outside the cafe. Neither of them realized that the simple discussion unfolding between them was the beginning of a connection that would gradually grow stronger in the days ahead. The afternoon light outside the cafe slowly faded as evening approached. Streetlights flickered on along the sidewalks while cars passed through Birmingham's downtown streets in steady lines. The cafe itself had grown quieter as customers finished their drinks and headed home. Alice Carter and David Whitmore were still sitting at the small table near the window. What had started as a brief conversation had stretched far longer than either of them expected. Neither seemed eager to leave. Eventually, Alice glanced at the clock hanging above the counter. I didn't realize how much time had passed, she said. David followed her gaze. I suppose that means we've been talking longer than planned. Alice smiled. That happens when conversations are interesting. David nodded in agreement. I can't remember the last time I had a conversation like this without checking my phone every few minutes. Alice laughed softly. That sounds like a busy life. It usually is. For years, David's daily schedule had been filled with meetings, travel arrangements, and constant decisions about his company's operations. But sitting there in the cafe felt surprisingly peaceful. He realized he had not thought about business once during the entire conversation. That alone felt unusual. Alice gathered her bag from the side of the chair. I should probably head home soon, she said. Another shift starts early tomorrow. David stood as well. May I walk with you? Alice hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Sure. They stepped outside into the evening air together. The temperature had cooled slightly, and the city carried the calm atmosphere that often settled in after the busiest part of the day had passed. They began walking slowly along the sidewalk. For a few minutes neither of them spoke. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. David eventually broke it. I've been thinking about something, he said. What's that? The way you talked about your neighborhood growing up? Alice glanced toward him. What about it? It reminded me of my own childhood. Alice looked curious. You mentioned that earlier. David nodded. When I was young, our neighbors watched out for each other the same way you described. If someone needed help repairing something or moving furniture, people showed up. Alice smiled. That kind of community stays with you. It does, David agreed. They continued walking past small shops and quiet office buildings. The city lights reflected softly off the windows around them. Alice noticed something about David's pace. He walked carefully, as if still recovering strength after his medical emergency. You should probably take it easy for a while, she said gently. David gave a small smile. My doctors have said the same thing. That means you should listen to them. I am, he replied. I just needed some fresh air. They reached a small park located between two streets. The benches were empty, and the trees swayed lightly in the evening breeze. Alice stopped near the entrance. This is where I usually turn, she said. David looked around the quiet park. It's nice here. Peaceful, Alice said. They sat down on one of the benches. The city's sounds continued softly in the distance. For a moment they simply watched people walking along the sidewalks. David leaned back slightly. You know something interesting? He said. Alice looked toward him. What? I've spent most of my life around people who measure success by numbers. Numbers, revenue growth, market share, expansion. Alice considered his words. And you? I used to think that was the only way to measure progress. Alice studied his expression carefully. And now? David looked toward the park trees before answering. Now I'm starting to think there are other ways. Alice smiled faintly. I see progress when a patient recovers and gets to go home. David nodded slowly. That sounds like a meaningful way to measure success. They sat quietly again for a moment. Neither of them felt the need to rush the conversation. Something about the evening felt simple and genuine. Would you mind if we did this again sometime? Alice raised an eyebrow slightly. Another long conversation? Yes. She thought about it for a second before answering. I wouldn't mind that, David smiled. Good. Over the next few days, their conversations continued. Sometimes they met again at the cafe, after Alice finished her hospital shift. Other times, they walked through different neighborhoods in Birmingham, talking about their experiences and perspectives on life. The conversations never felt forced. They moved naturally from topic to topic: work, family, community, personal values. David discovered that Alice approached life with the same quiet determination he had respected during the airport emergency. Alice discovered that behind David's success in business was someone who valued responsibility and perseverance. Each meeting revealed another small piece of who they were. Gradually, a sense of mutual respect began to grow between them. Neither of them rushed the connection. It developed slowly through conversations, shared stories, and the simple act of spending time together. Neither Alice nor David realized exactly when the shift occurred, but somewhere between their walks through Birmingham's streets and their quiet discussions over coffee, something new had begun to form. Not just gratitude, not just curiosity, something deeper, a connection neither of them had expected when their paths first crossed during a moment of crisis inside a crowded airport terminal. Late afternoon sunlight filled the hospital parking lot as Alice Carter finished another long shift. The day had followed the familiar rhythm of hospital life: patient rounds, medication schedules, conversations with worried families, and the quiet satisfaction that came from helping people through difficult moments. By the time she stepped outside the hospital doors, the cool Birmingham air felt refreshing. Alice walked slowly toward her car, stretching slightly after hours on her feet. Her phone buzzed in her bag. When she checked the screen, she saw a message from David Whitmore. Over the past few weeks, the two of them had continued meeting occasionally for coffee or evening walks around the city. Their conversations had become something both of them looked forward to. The message was brief. Are you free tomorrow evening? I'd like to ask you something. Alice smiled slightly and typed a reply. Depends on the question. A moment later, the phone buzzed again. Alice paused. She leaned against the side of her car while reading the message again. A charity event. That was very different from their usual quiet conversations in cafes and parks. She quickly typed back, "Why me?" The response came almost immediately. Because the cause matters to both of us. Alice thought for a moment before answering. What kind of event is it? David's reply appeared. A fundraiser supporting community health programs. Doctors, hospital leaders, business sponsors. The usual crowd. Alice hesitated. Large public events were not something she typically attended. Her life mostly moved between the hospital, home, and the small places around Birmingham where she felt comfortable. The idea of attending a formal gathering filled with business leaders and medical executives made her slightly uneasy. Another message arrived. No pressure. I just thought you might like to see the work being done for community healthcare. Alice considered his words. Community healthcare had always mattered deeply to her. Many of the patients she treated came from neighborhoods where medical access was limited. Programs that supported those communities could make a real difference. Still, she remained uncertain. She typed slowly. I don't exactly own fancy event clothes. David responded almost immediately. It's not about appearances. Alice laughed quietly to herself. That sounded like something he genuinely believed. She stared at the message screen for another moment. During their conversations over the past few weeks, David had shown a sincere interest in the same values that shaped her life: service, responsibility, and community support. The charity event he mentioned aligned with those values. Finally, she typed back, "All right, I'll come." The response from David appeared a few seconds later. "Thank you. I'll pick you up at 7. Alice slipped her phone back into her bag and climbed into her car. As she drove home through the evening traffic, her thoughts drifted toward the upcoming event. She imagined a room filled with influential people discussing healthcare funding and charitable initiatives. It felt very different from the hospital floor where she usually worked. Yet something about the invitation felt meaningful. David had not treated her like someone from a completely different world. Instead, he had always approached their conversations with respect and genuine curiosity. Perhaps this event would offer a chance to see another side of the healthcare system, the side focused on resources, planning, and long-term support for communities. The following evening arrived quickly. When David arrived at Alice's apartment building, he stepped out of the car and greeted her with a warm smile. "You look ready," he said. Alice adjusted the simple dress she had chosen for the occasion. "I hope this is appropriate." "It's perfect," David replied. They drove through downtown Birmingham as the city lights reflected against the evening sky. When they arrived at the event venue, Alice noticed the large building glowing with soft lights near the entrance. Guests were already gathering inside. For a brief moment she hesitated. David noticed. "Feeling nervous?" he asked gently. "A little," she admitted. David offered a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, just be yourself." Together they walked toward the entrance. Alice had no idea that the evening ahead would soon place her at the center of a moment she never expected. The same quiet decision she made inside an airport terminal was about to receive recognition far beyond anything she had imagined. The large hall inside the event venue glowed with warm lighting. Soft music played near the stage, while guests gathered in small groups throughout the room. Round tables filled the center of the hall, each decorated with simple arrangements of white flowers. Alice Carter paused just inside the entrance, taking in the scene around her. People dressed in formal suits and elegant dresses moved easily through the crowd. Conversations flowed between healthcare professionals, business sponsors, and community leaders who had come to support the fundraising effort. It was a world very different from the hospital floor. Alice felt slightly out of place. David Whitmore seemed to notice. "Just think of it as a room full of people who want to improve healthcare," he said quietly. Alice smiled. "That makes it sound less intimidating." They walked farther into the hall. Several guests recognized David immediately. A few stopped briefly to greet him with respectful handshakes. Alice observed the way people spoke to him. It became clear that David held a position of influence among many of the attendees, yet he never allowed those brief conversations to distract him for long. After each greeting, he returned his attention to Alice. Eventually, they reached their table near the center of the room. The event organizer stepped onto the stage shortly afterward. The music softened, and conversations gradually faded as guests turned their attention forward. "Good evening, everyone," the organizer began. "Thank you for joining us tonight in support of community health programs throughout Birmingham." Applause moved gently through the room. Alice listened carefully as the organizer explained how the funds raised during the evening would support clinics, medical outreach programs, and preventative healthcare services in neighborhoods that needed them most. These were exactly the kinds of initiatives Alice believed in. Many of the patients she treated at the hospital faced challenges that could have been prevented through better access to care earlier in their lives. After several minutes, the organizer continued speaking. "Tonight, we also want to recognize someone whose actions represent the very spirit of healthcare service." Alice glanced toward David briefly, assuming the announcement referred to a doctor or medical researcher. The organizer continued. "A few weeks ago, something remarkable happened inside Birmingham Shuttlesworth Airport." Alice froze slightly. Her eyes moved toward the stage. The room grew quiet as guests listened. "A man collapsed in the terminal after suffering sudden cardiac arrest," the organizer explained. Dozens of travelers were nearby, but one person stepped forward without hesitation. Alice slowly turned her head toward David. He gave her a calm look that suggested he already knew where the speech was heading. The organizer continued. "That person began life-saving care immediately, performing CPR and using the airport's emergency defibrillator until medical responders arrived." Several people in the audience nodded with interest. Alice felt a wave of nervous realization building inside her. The organizer paused briefly. That quick action saved a life. The room remained silent as guests waited for the rest of the story. "And tonight, that life is sitting right here in this room." The organizer gestured toward David Whitmore. A ripple of recognition moved through the audience. Alice looked down at the table for a moment, feeling slightly overwhelmed. She had not expected any attention for what she had done. But this story is not about the man who survived. It is about the nurse who refused to walk away. Alice's heart began beating faster. David leaned slightly toward her. Just breathe, he whispered gently. The organizer spoke clearly into the microphone. Please join me in recognizing the person who made that decision, Alice Carter. For a moment, Alice did not move. Then the room erupted into applause, heads turned toward her table. Some guests stood as they clapped, recognizing the courage behind the story. Alice felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her. David gave her a small nod of encouragement. Slowly, she stood from her chair. The applause continued. When she reached the microphone, the applause gradually faded. She looked out across the room at the many faces watching her. I didn't expect this, she admitted softly. A few people in the audience smiled. Alice continued speaking. I was just doing what my training told me to do. She paused briefly. And what my heart told me to do. The audience listened quietly. When someone needs help, you don't think about anything else. You just step forward. Another round of applause filled the hall. Alice stepped back slightly as the organizer thanked her for her courage and compassion. When she returned to the table, David stood and shook her hand warmly. You deserved that moment, he said. Alice smiled modestly. I still feel like I just did my job. David looked at her thoughtfully. Sometimes doing your job is exactly what makes the world better. Alice did not realize it yet, but the recognition she had just received was only the beginning of what David Whitmore had planned for the evening. The applause slowly faded as Alice Carter returned to her seat beside David Whitmore. Even after sitting down, she could still feel the attention lingering in the room. Guests at nearby tables continued glancing toward her with quiet admiration. Alice lowered her gaze to the table for a moment. Public recognition had never been something she sought. Her work in the hospital had always been about helping people in private moments, patients recovering quietly, families finding relief after difficult news, and lives improving one person at a time. Standing in front of a room full of people had felt unfamiliar. David noticed the thoughtful expression on her face. You handled that very well, he said. Alice smiled modestly. I'm still trying to understand why this happened. David leaned slightly closer. Because people need reminders that compassion matters. Alice nodded but did not respond immediately. The event organizer returned to the microphone at the front of the hall. Before we continue with the rest of the evening, the organizer announced, there is one more important announcement. The room quieted again. Several guests turned their chairs toward the stage. Alice assumed the program would now move on to the next fundraising topic. Instead, the organizer continued. Tonight's event celebrates community healthcare. But meaningful change often begins with individual actions that inspire others. The organizer paused briefly before continuing. One such action took place at Birmingham Shuttlesworth Airport, where Alice Carter chose to help a stranger instead of walking away. Alice felt the attention shift toward her table once again. David remained calm beside her. The organizer continued speaking. That decision represents the kind of compassion that strengthens communities and saves lives. Another pause followed. And it inspired something new. Alice looked up again. The organizer gestured toward David Whitmore. David Whitmore would now like to say a few words. David stood slowly from his chair. Alice watched him with curiosity as he walked toward the stage. The room grew quiet once more. David reached the microphone and looked across the audience. For most of my life, he began, I believe success was measured by what we build, what we earn, and how far our work reaches. Several people in the audience nodded. But a few weeks ago, he continued, I learned something more important. He paused briefly. A stranger saved my life. The room remained silent. David continued speaking calmly. When I collapsed in the airport terminal, dozens of people were nearby. Many were rushing to catch flights or continue their journeys. His gaze moved toward Alice. But one person stopped. Alice lowered her eyes slightly. That person gave me another chance to live, David said. The audience listened attentively. I later learned that helping me meant she missed an opportunity she had worked years to achieve. Alice looked up again. The room remained completely quiet now. David continued. That moment stayed with me. He paused briefly before continuing. I realized something important. Acts of compassion deserve more than quiet appreciation. They deserve to inspire action. Several guests leaned forward with interest. David rested his hands lightly on the podium. That is why tonight I am announcing the creation of a new initiative. Alice felt her heart begin to race slightly. The Alice Community Health Fellowship, David said clearly. A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. This fellowship will support nurses and healthcare workers who want to bring stronger medical resources into underserved communities. Alice stared at him in disbelief. David continued. It will fund leadership training, community health programs, and opportunities for professionals who want to improve healthcare access in cities like Birmingham. Applause began rising through the hall. David smiled slightly, and fittingly, the first person to receive this fellowship will be the woman who inspired it. He looked toward Alice again. Alice Carter. The applause grew louder. Alice felt completely stunned. She slowly stood from her chair again as the audience applauded. David stepped down from the stage and returned to her side. "I hope you'll accept it," he said quietly. Alice struggled to find the right words. This is incredible," she finally said. David nodded. "You earned it." Alice looked around the room. The fellowship represented something far greater than recognition. It represented the chance to do exactly what she had always wanted: improve healthcare in communities that needed it most. Her voice softened slightly. "I don't know what to say," David smiled. "Just say yes." Alice took a breath and nodded. "Yes." The room erupted with applause again. For a moment Alice thought back to the morning inside the airport terminal. At that time, she believed she had lost the opportunity she had worked so hard to achieve. Now she understood something different. Sometimes the paths we plan lead in unexpected directions. Sometimes one decision changes everything. And sometimes kindness opens doors that careful planning never could. As the applause continued and the evening moved forward, Alice Carter realized that the journey she thought she had missed had simply taken a different path. A path that began with compassion. A path that now held possibilities she had never imagined. Would you have made the same choice Alice did in that airport terminal? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you enjoy powerful stories about courage, community, and unexpected moments that change lives, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Mr. Obama Stories, because sometimes the smallest decision becomes the beginning of something extraordinary.